Today I just wanted to make a little short video about a little topic that came onto my mind. Yeah, just a little day ago. Different sounds that can come from the car or the engine that could possibly be a catastrophic sound or a sound that is not catastrophic at all. It's like a little, yeah. One sound is the indication that a motor is about to blow up. The other sound is a little indication that you need to fix this. Not like immediately, but it's a little inconvenience, so you have to fix this soon. So, yeah, it's gonna be a little annoying. Because I saw a video the other day about when a guy had just renovated a BMW engine. He put in, he put in new rod bearings. I know he did that, and crank bearings and all that, but especially the rod bearings. So he renovated the engine, put in the rod bearings, and then he took the car for a spin. And I think he had been maybe driven like 5 or 10 minutes. I'm not sure, depending on the video. But just when he was about to close out the video, he heard like this metallic, like really bad screeching sound coming from the engine, and the look on his face was just like, this is bad. And he knew that he also probably knew what it was, and he thought that he basically had spun a rod bearing. And I'm gonna talk more about that, but the reason is because I saw this video just a few weeks ago. And when I was driving my Ford Fiesta to work the other day, my heart just dropped on the way to work because I heard the same screeching sound in that video that I did in my car. And I was just like, really? Really? I just saw the video the other day where he spun a rod bearing, and now I'm hearing the exact same sound in my car. How is this possible? So I checked the oil later, and it was a little bit low. So after work, I went down to my local gas station and bought myself a little more motor oil just to top it off, just so it was within the approved limit. But I didn't think that was the case, because I also felt the alternator. The tension on the alternator belt that goes to the alternator and the water pump and down to the crankshaft. That had started to become a little bit loose, a lot looser, because when I put it on a few months back, I tightened it pretty, so it's pretty much so I couldn't like have a lot of wiggle room. But there was a lot of wiggle room now. When I took the water pump pulley and twisted that, I heard that sound. And also, I can't confirm this from fact, but when a rod bearing spins, and also when a rod bearing spins, a rod bearing is like two halves of a metallic / copper bearing that's shaped like a half moon, and it's two halves like this, and that is connected and it sits fixed on the rod in the engine, and that is then later screwed on the crankshaft, so the bearing halves sits fixed on the crank on the on the rod. And then it spins on the crankshaft axle, because on the crankshaft there is oil galleys. So when you start the car and the oil pump starts pumping oil, up in those galleys it comes high pressure oil that creates a little bit of oil film between the crankshaft and the rod bearings. So the rod bearings actually follows the rod, but what could happen is, if the engine loses oil pressure or if it's too little oil, the rod bearings actually can start spinning. So when it gets started of oil, it becomes so hot against the crankshaft, so the bearings, what do you say, it bites down on the crankshaft and starts spinning. So the broad bearings just start spinning on the crankshaft and on the rod. And that creates that screeching metallic sound that you never want to hear, because if you hear that, it is like 9 out of 10 times it's game over for the engine, because you have to tear it down and pray that it's a fixable situation and not, remove the engine and put in a new one, which is extremely expensive. But where I wanted to go with this was that when a crank bearing starts spinning, that screeching metallic sound sounds exactly like a alternator belt when it's grinding against the pulley of both the generator and the alternator. Generator is the Swedish word that we use in Swedish. So when the belt becomes a little bit too loose, it starts gliding over the alternator pulley and the water pump pulley. That creates, like I said, the exact same sound. I think so. It sounds exactly like when a rod bearing spins, and that's why I was like, I just saw a video the other day of how it sounds when a rod bearing spins, and it sounds exactly like this in the engine. But I've been driving the car for 2 days now, and it's still a little bit of that sound, but I'm 100% sure that it's the alternator belt that is slipping. So yeah, that was a relief for me. So I'm just gonna tighten that up so I don't have to hear that sound again, and possibly in the future, knock on wood, if I tension that belt and I know that it doesn't come from there, and I know that if I hear that sound again and then the belt is tightened, I know that it's probably the crank bearings that's failed. But like I said, knock on wood, I hope that never happens. So I just wanted to talk about that, and yeah, I have a suggestion. Write down in the comments, and if you know any other sounds that comes from the engine, because like rod knock or like any sort of bearing up, because if a rod bearing starts knocking, this can also happen if a rod bearing gets starved of oil. If they get starved of oil, it's not always that the rod bearings start spinning. They can still stay in place, but they stay in place and still get starved of oil. It will still, just tear that bearing apart, and just the material of that bearing will just become thinner and thinner. So the what's the name of it? The space between the rod bearing and the bearing becomes bigger, and what happens then is every time that the rod comes down on the crankshaft and goes up, it will just do this, and that's when you hear that knocking sound from the engine. And that's also a sound that you never want to hear, because that means that you have to, in the best case, just change the bearings. When you hear that sound, you shut off the engine and take it to a repair shop or home or whatever and just change it, so that the crankshaft doesn't take any damage. Because if you ignore it and just keep driving and the sound goes worse and worse, that knocking would just come bigger and bigger. In the worst case scenario, It can be so bad, because when that crankshaft spins, it's with a lot of force. A lot of force. Because that piston gets pulled down by internal combustion in the cylinder. It's an explosion that sends that piston down. So that's a lot of force. And if that space between the crankshaft and the bearings become too big, and that explosion finally happens that pushes it down, it can be such a bad force. It can be like such a big force that the two screws that holds the rod cap to the rod can come loose. It will just strip that bolt off, and if that happens, the whole rod can just go pew, straight out of the engine block, and you will have an inspection hole about this big. No, it could be this big, it could be this big, doesn't matter. But the rod will poke out of the engine and say hello to you. In worst case scenarios, if you ignore the knocking sound from the engine and keeps driving, that's what will happen. So yeah, back to my original question. Is there any sound that you know that sounds very similar to another, where this sound, it's nothing bad, like you know where it is, and it's not a bad thing. You can change it in a day or a week, doesn't matter. And you have another sound that sounds really similar to this, but if you keep driving with this sound, the engine will go kabloom. Is there any sound that you know that's familiar in that way? Leave a comment, because like mine that I've realized now is spun rod bearing and belt slipping. It sounds exactly the same, like scary similar. So that's why you have to check your oil, check your belts, just to daily maintenance, especially your oil. Your oil is very important to check and maintain, because it's the most important thing you have in an engine. Nothing destroys an engine faster than not maintaining your oil. Super important. Also, I bought this a few days ago. Not sponsored, by the way. This is a mini compressor, and I just pumped my all my tires with it, and I love this thing. This is awesome, because I have a big compressor inside, but you know, you don't want to start that up just to pump a few tires. I don't feel like that's necessary. So I bought this for just a few, should I say it in Swedish crowns? Well, it costed about 300 Swedish crowns, which is about, in US dollars, is about $30. It's awesome. Really great. Just when you want to do a quick little job, popping the tires, and you don't have to go out in the garage and start that up. And this becomes really in handy. So yeah, I think that's it. Just my little rant about horrible and less horrible engine sounds. So that'll be it for me. Take care, guys. Bye.